Welcome to Policy Review Day. Everyone enjoy lunch? All right, that's great. It's such an honor to welcome 355 advisory committee members that represent 86 counties here today with all our guests. And it's so good to see everyone. I'm always impressed by how many of you are willing to leave the farm. I had so many people telling me as I welcome today, Mr. Harding, we wouldn't miss it, and that just really warms my heart. So thank you for being here. Also had some people say we needed a break. So I hope this is a little bit of a break from whether we've been dealing with drought or flood or all the weather issues we've had here in North Carolina. You know, time is precious, and so we especially want to do as much as we can today to fit in our policy work and give you good information for your farms at this point in the summer. And so I recognize and appreciate that you're committed to our organization. Again, thank you. We do want to do an invocation at this point, and I would now ask Andrea Locklear, a current member of our LEAD program, to please come forward and give us an invocation at this time. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you, and good afternoon. May we bow our heads. Dear gracious and heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you have given us. God, we thank you for Farm Bureau, and we thank you for their goal where they protect the farms and the rural families in North Carolina. God, we thank you for our farmers and ranchers and what they do. God, when they need the resources, we ask that you provide them to them. All these things we ask in your holy name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. For many of you that have been coming for many years, you expect to see Commissioner Troxler here. Commissioner sends his regrets. He actually has a group of farmers from Africa on his farm today. We all know if somebody's visiting your farm, you need to be there. So we understand where he's at. You know, he often tells the story about an ag econ professor he had who first told him, aside from the weather, and we all know what the weather's been doing to us this year, nothing impacts the farm more than foreign policy. We can give example after example of how legislation and regulation can help or hurt our businesses. So the discussions and the areas of concern that come out of today's meetings are very important. Our Farm Bureau policy is what sets our organization apart from all the others. You tell us what all the farmers need, and we get to work on your behalf. So I really want to challenge you all today to take your time, go through our current policy, and then take that information back to your county or your district policy review meetings this fall. They are good places to work together and have discussions with other counties that have similar concerns. You've all heard us say it, and we call ourselves the voice of agriculture. And the voice is only as strong as our grassroots policy. So earlier this year, for the first time since I've been elected president, I went around and we had 8 district meetings across the state. Many of you attended those district meetings. At every single one of those district meetings, when we got around to talking about farm problems, the number one concern that came up was farmland preservation. We all know that North Carolina ranks second in the United States for projected farmland loss. And so our team came back to Raleigh and we quickly started to strategize to how we work on this issue. We started by reactivating our Land Use Advisory Committee and started having some high-level discussions with them. Farmland preservation, and you're going to hear about this in a minute, is a complex issue. And how land is protected can look different from county to county and certainly from farm to farm. We also have to strike a balance from what it looks like protecting farmland versus protecting private property rights. Land is not just an investment, it's a tool, and our farmers deserve the right to choose the future of their investments. There is no one silver bullet that's going to solve this issue. I think we all realize that. I've said it's more like a shotgun approach. We're going to have to look at it that way. We're going to have honest conversations about what our communities will look like in the future, and honest conversations about how we encourage the next generation of agriculture to stay on the farm. And Farm Bureau is uniquely positioned to be a leader in those conversations because we are in all 100 counties. So today we thought we'd have a panel lined up with some professionals to give all of us some additional information and perspective on farmland loss and preservation. On this panel today we have Dr. Michael Klein, our state demographer, who's going to tell us where all these people came from. We have Stephen Finn. Stephen is a land development administrator for Wake County, and I'm really excited, we're in Wake County obviously, about what Wake County has done, some really innovative things in this space. Leslie Vanden Herrick is with American Farmland Trust and has a strong background with soil and water that works closely with all of us. And then of course Evan Davis is here from our own Department of Agriculture to talk about the department's efforts. And you know, Commissioner Troxler, this has been his #1 talking point. So they're going to be led by Steve Woodson, our Associate General Counsel, who works very closely on all of our land use issues and with the Land Use Committee. And so I'm going to turn it over to them as they come forward now to have a panel discussion about this topic. And Steve's going to take care of moderating this panel for us today.
Thank you, President Harding. For our format for this panel discussion, we've prepared a dozen questions for our panelists. We'll try to get to all of these, but we're hoping that the questions will raise some issues that can be discussed among the panelists. So if we don't get to all of them because of time, it doesn't mean that we haven't actually discussed all of the information that was in the questions. While the panelists won't be making presentations, we will have some information up on the screen. In the interest of time, we're not going to have any audience participation today, but we're hoping that some or all of the panelists can hang around a little bit afterwards in case there are any questions, anybody wants to talk to them. Our first question for the panel is for Dr. Klein. This slide from your presentation that shows the change in population in North Carolina by county from 2010 to 2020. As we can see, while North Carolina had a growth rate of 9.5% statewide, over half of our counties actually experienced a population decrease. Is this a trend that's likely to continue? And what, in your opinion, does such a trend mean for agriculture and for efforts to preserve farmland in North Carolina?
Thank you. Let's try again. So first of all, the slide actually is a different thing, but I'll touch that and get to the slide that you see up there. So the question is, does this trend continue? Now, if you look at the last decade, it's the first time in our history that the majority of our counties lost population. All of those counties were rural in nature, and we saw growth in our major urban centers. In fact, almost half of our growth occurred in Wake and Mecklenburg counties alone. Now, the good news is since 2020, and really this is kind of a trend that was happening before COVID, but it was kind of paused by COVID, we saw some gains in some of those counties that lost population. So the good news is that there will be, at least our latest projections show that there'll be only about 35 counties continue to lose population. So the majority of our counties will gain population or are currently gaining population. And what you see here is kind of the reiteration of that fact that most of our growth is occurring in our major urban centers. Now this looks at our population density in 2050. Most of our growth, again, continues to happen in our major urban centers, our areas around Wake County, Mecklenburg, kind of that Piedmont urban crescent, and then also other urban counties in the state. And then for our rural counties, it's those counties that have high natural amenities. And that's where we see growth continue to occur in the future.
Did you want to talk about number 8, the other slide?
I think it'll, next one of the.
Okay. Our second question is for Leslie. Can you comment on the statements of Dr. Klein based on the information that American Farmland Trust has gathered for its publication Farms Under Threat 2040?
Okay. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of a background on the Farms Under Threat. It is a multi-year initiative by AFT to document the status of threats to America's land and offer policy solutions to save land. So we've maintained data on America's farm and ranch land since 1986. In 1993, we released the first Farming on the Edge report and releasing 3 additional iterations of that report before developing the first Farms Under Threat report in 2018. So the 2020 Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report that Steve just referenced, uses upgraded national data sets to map farmland conversion between 2001 and 2016. This mapping, coupled with Ag Land Protection Scorecard, ranks states and farmland protection and policies will be discussed today. So back to the question at hand, we looked at slightly different data sets than what Dr. Klein referenced. So some of our numbers don't align completely. But one of the things that we did discover overall is that even in rural areas, in rural states where population is declining, there's still a loss in farmland. So that was demonstrated when West Virginia was studied in the State of the States. So it's really crucial that even if you are experiencing population decline, that you still consider and plan for the preservation and protection of farm and ranch land.
Can I add to I think if you go to the other slide that I mentioned, and that
Can we go to slide number 8?
that'll reiterate what she just said. No, that's perfect. So this looks at farm acreage from the 2012 ag census to the 2022 ag census compared to population growth in 2010 and 2020 based on again, it's looking at counties, which is a little bit different than what they looked at, but looking at county-based, looking at those metropolitan areas, those core centers, that metro central counties. You see tremendous growth in population and significant losses in farmland. Same thing with our suburban and exurban counties, those outlying suburban or metro counties shown there. And then you see those rural counties losing population overall in the aggregate, and also losing some farmland as well.
Leslie, do you have any information regarding soil qualities? I guess it looks like a lot of the farmland that might be lost in these urban areas is closer into urban growth where soil types, generally the better soils are usually settled and are more densely populated than some of the soils in the rural areas. Is there any information that
I don't have
AFT has
anything specific on that. I can check with our Farmland Information Center and get back to you with that. They would have, they're the keeper of all of that information, but I don't have access to that today.
The next question is for Evan Davis. The period of the American Farmland Trust report was from 2000 to 2016. Most of our state's voluntary farmland preservation measures, such as present use value property tax assessment, voluntary agricultural districts, and conservation easements, have been in place during that time. In your opinion, or in the Commissioner's opinion, can we retain enough farmland through voluntary measures to maintain agriculture as a primary driver of our state's economy? And do you have any ideas on ways to strengthen and improve any of our voluntary programs?
Yeah, I see this in one of 3 ways. How can we improve current programs and processes? Can we add benefits to existing programs? And then what else can we add to the farmland preservation toolbox? So for example, we're here in Wake County, and Wake County won the Commissioner's Friends of Farmland Award last year for their efforts in farmland preservation. They used the rollback from withdrawals from PUV and put all of that funding into their farmland preservation program. And most of that conversion was for development. So you're taking the converted land and saving what's left? Is there a way that we could look at, instead of 3 years, a 4-year look back? Would that maybe not allow as much development and add more to the pot? That's one possibility. With an existing program like the Enhanced Voluntary Agricultural Districts, this is a 10-year irrevocable conservation agreement. The big question is, what's the benefit? Can we add funding to the Enhanced Voluntary Agricultural Districts as an additional incentive to have a short or medium-term solution for landowners? I think that's something that we can look at. And then what are tools that are not currently in North Carolina that we can add? One would be the Buy, Protect, Sell program. This is a program where entities like land trusts buy vulnerable properties, protect them with a conservation easement so they won't be converted, and then sell them at a reduced cost to new or transitioning landowners. So there's lots of opportunities to add to the toolbox. I think that the voluntary nature of these programs is what makes it so strong. And one other point would be to change the mindset. This isn't just something else that can be done, a secondary program. It needs to be a primary factor for landowners and farmers across the state that, hey, farmland preservation is something that we should be actively pursuing rather than just an additional opportunity.
You mentioned the Buy, Protect, Sell program. I believe the group, the Conservation Fund, has been working on that in North Carolina, and they've been working in Mecklenburg County area. I didn't know if either you, Evan, or you, Leslie, might have a little bit more information about their program and their progress.
Yep, they have just started that program in North Carolina. They've had the initial program in the suburbs of Atlanta, in Georgia, so they're taking that existing model and applying it to the greater Charlotte area. So we've had a few meetings about that. I think the program in earnest is going to be kicking off this fall, and it's a great opportunity for soil and water conservation districts and land trusts to team up with the Conservation Fund for this particular program. So we'll certainly keep everyone in the loop on that program. It's an exciting opportunity.
Thank you. The next question is for Stephen Finn. We all know that bona fide farming activities are exempt from county zoning, but that does not mean that county zoning ordinance don't have an impact on agricultural land. Can you give us some examples of zoning ordinances that have protected working lands while also providing for mitigation of impact on property values?
Sure. I hope everybody can hear me. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Steve, for getting me involved in the panel. I always get a little nervous when I follow experts, such as my colleagues that have been speaking here before me. I want to emphasize in Wake County, we're a low-density option in the eyes of the state to protect our 4 water supply watersheds. So inherently, we have larger lot zoning in the 42% of Wake County, which is the unincorporated areas outside of our 12 municipalities. So that said, I also want to advocate and give Teresa Furr from our Soil and Water Conservation District a big pat on the back because she works closely with our office, and more so than my office, I would say they're the advocates within the Wake County family. They did our preservation plan and so forth, so I'd recognize her as well. I'd like to touch base on 3 items, and they're not perfection, they're not without flaw, but to answer the question in earnest. We're getting about 63 to 65 people a day net gain into Wake County. That has fluctuated somewhere between 57 and 65 in the last 5 to 7 years in particular. So there's an awful lot of demand within the entirety of Wake County for houses, especially with some of the jobs and job creations that are out there. People need roofs over their head, and this is going to impact urbanization, as you all well know. Something the county has done recently that I was involved in is we tendered an ordinance amendment to allow what we call accessory dwelling units. You look at the changing demographics. We heard Michael talk about some statistic earlier, but generationally speaking, we have multi-generations. We have people with 2 or 3 generations, grandparents, children, grandchildren living in the same house. So in line with that, looking at some of the demands and interests in housing in Wake County, we changed our zoning ordinance to allow what we call accessory dwelling units. So if there's a primary residence, for sake of example, a 2,000 square foot house on a single lot, we used to allow only one house on a lot. However, through this provision, we allow a second accessory dwelling up to 50% of the square footage of the primary residence. So that has addressed housing needs and also had a bit of an impact. I can't quantify that with a number for you, but we've received nothing but positive feedback in terms of this option that allows for housing typology and perhaps reduces, albeit to a lesser extent, some of the strains on the demand for lots for housing. Number two, open space standards. Some of you may have heard of cluster zoning. Essentially, this is what we've done. At the end of December of 2022, we created an option within our zoning regulations to allow a reduction in lot sizes. Because we are a low-density option in the eyes of the state for water supply, watershed protections, and we have some limits in terms of what we can or can't do with densities. However, for example, in our water supply watershed zonings, R80W and R40W, normally they would require 40,000 square feet or 80,000 square feet, essentially 1 to 2 acre lots. Now you can create lots that are half of that size. In R30 zoning, you can go down to 6,000 square foot lots. So we've made adjustments to take into account soil conditions, other variables that I feel provide a little bit more flexibility in response to the marketplace, while also enhancing as a narrative through our land use plan and our unified development ordinance, open space preservation. Finally, I would talk about home occupations. What does this have to do with farming or large lots? Well, actually, we've amended our zoning ordinance to create more flexibility in the event people have to have secondary incomes. That's a reality for some of us. I just read in the publication USA Today last week that almost 35% of Americans have a side hustle. I would be one of those. I ref soccer outside of my day job. So we've created an opportunity to allow for home occupations of varying scope and scale that could be done in a garage, in someone's accessory building, within their house. So this allows for some tax relief in terms of office space and so forth, but it has also resulted in an opportunity where people are not having the demand for office space or retail space. A lot of the startups, I'm not an economist, but a lot of the startup businesses still in America are less than 6 people. And so our home occupation provides for some opportunity for latitude there. So in summation, 3, I'd say, improvements that we've made in recent years. We allow accessory dwellings to provide some housing typology and reduce, albeit to some extent, a lower extent, some of the demands for lots in the county. Open space standards where we allow reductions in terms of new subdivisions. I feel that provides a lot more flexibility with and in harmony with the environmental features that may exist, and then home occupations that allow people to create a secondary source of income as may be interested or needed. Thank you.
Quick follow-up to that on your low-density option. Is there a trade-off for having the higher density development? Or is there some land protected as a trade-off for that, or?
That's a great question, Steve. Just to jump right to the answer, in terms of density, there's no trade-off. We have tried density bonuses and incentives in the past, and since our UDO was adopted in April of 2006, we've not had one such application grow feet and come in the form of an application. However, land preservation, protection of open space, there is an incentive, that is the incentive, to design more in harmony with the soils, with the nature. And as you may know, some of you may know, Wake County is very progressive in terms of our open space program in parks and recreation with the trails and so forth. So there is an incentive to do so, design with the lower lots, but there's not a trade-off for density.
Dr. Klein, according to your presentation, the vast majority of North Carolina's growth comes from net migration, and at least one study has projected that by 2040, all of our growth will come from net migration. What does this trend, combined with our loss of farmland and the loss of population in rural North Carolina, reveal, if anything, about the face of agriculture in the future?
So, first of all, it shows how popular North Carolina is, and part of it is because of our rural areas, our open spaces, our, can y'all hear? Is that working? I'll make sure. Our open spaces, our natural amenities, beyond the economic opportunities that bringing people here, are those open spaces. But a little bit reason why that net migration is becoming more important for our growth is due to our aging of our population. So if you look the last 3 decades, about 2/3 of our growth was due to net migration, the remainder being natural increase. For most of our history, we were actually, all of our growth came from natural increase because we sent people elsewhere, to the west, to the other parts of the south, Midwest, and Northeast. As economic opportunities came to North Carolina, people stayed here and didn't leave. So the last 3 decades, we have 2/3 of our growth from net migration. As we look to the future, as you said, it'll be becoming more important as a part of our growth. Now, that's due to declines in fertility and our aging of our population. In 2011, there's not any baby boomers here, are there? 2011, the first cohort of the baby boom generation turned 65 years of age. And since that time, over 100,000 North Carolinians have turned 65 years of age every year. And we'll see that pattern continue. So, our growth occurs from natural increase, more births than deaths, and net migration. And unfortunately, nobody's found the fountain of youth. So as you get older, the risk of you dying increases. As we have more deaths and not enough births to counter that, you have to have net migration, more people either both staying here and not leaving for other states, and people coming from other states in the country. Nationally, by 2038, all of our growth will be through immigration for those same reasons. And what does this mean, or how does this relate to agriculture? Well, part of it is the challenge within agriculture itself. You look at the agricultural census for 2022, about almost 40% of ag producers are 65 years of age or older. For the state, our state population, about 17% are 65 years of age or older. By the end of this decade, about 1 in 5 will be North Carolinians will be 65 years of age or older. And by the early part of next decade, there'll be more older adults than there are children. So that aging population means what's going to happen when those producers pass on. Are there going to be producers, or are there going to be new generations to take over? A little bit of the good news that I saw in the ag census is there is some growth in the under 35, number of producers under 35. So that's a little bit of some of the impacts to agriculture.
Thank you. Leslie, in everybody's program, we have inserted the North Carolina State of the State report from American Farmland Trust. And that report indicates that North Carolina's policy response to loss of farmland is not equal to the threat posed by population growth and development. Can you give us some examples of actions taken by other states that that North Carolina could implement to merit a higher score? In other words, how can North Carolina get extra credit on this exam?
Well, there's a few areas we could improve. Pace and planning are sorry, thank you. Can you guys hear me now? Pace and planning are the highest priority, so we'll touch upon those a bit first. Enabling North Carolina's PACE program, and actually, let me preface this by saying, Evan, you still can't hear me? Let's try this again. I am going to echo some of what Evan mentioned when he was speaking about the toolbox, because some of the efforts that he mentioned kind of align with recommendations from AFT. So enabling North Carolina's PACE programs to buy land outright could help landowners who either need to act quickly or may not be interested in selling an easement. This option could also allow for the completion of strategically important projects or statewide coverage. Beyond that, the program could seek to maintain ag use and affordability on protected land by an affirmative ag provision to ensure that land remains in ag use, and an option, or to provide an option for state and local entities to acquire land at ag value if it goes up for sale to a non-farm use. There was a study done in Vermont, a case study, and one of the things that came up in that case study as a recurring theme was concern over the affordability of land in order to transfer. There was a lot of mention about the aging farm population. The majority of those people do not have succession plans or transfer plans. At least that's what was found in the Vermont study. So North Carolina funds available through Evans program can help currently with farmland protection. If there's opportunities to expand that, the addition of funds to help with general planning or planning for agriculture, not just for preservation, would be helpful. Let me back up. The scorecard that was done for this has not been updated, but AFT is in the process of changing the parameters and how they look at that, so it'll be a little bit based on more qualitative information. So there is a dashboard that is going to be updated, and one of the first aspects of that will be the PACE programs. So North Carolina's score could be going up based on some things that they've already done, so we're just looking at some additional things that could be added. So adding additional funds for planning, to allow communities to plan for agriculture. There's also several policy-based opportunities related to planning. Having a state planning agency or authority and state goals for saving ag land and compact development could help to provide a framework for local plans to align with the state. The next highest areas for extra credit would be property tax relief in agricultural districts. So we do have some recommendations and suggestions based on our research and things that other states have done. Tax relief policy fixes could include provisions to protect and conserve ag land, including restrictive easements, agreements, a first right of refusal for local governments, that would be triggered by proposed conversion of land use and conservation requirements. Another option would be adding an incentive for landowners who implement certain conservation practices, or even for those who remain in compliance with other environmental rules and regulations. The state of Maryland uses their transfer tax funds to support farmland protection. The funds are shared between the counties in the state. There are already a number of counties in North Carolina, I believe Wake is one of them, that use funds from the deferred tax repayment when something is pulled out of the present use valuation, and they pay those 3 years in back taxes. So those funds can be used for agricultural purposes, and I think that varies a bit from county to county because it is not a state mandate. The state could consider a policy that requires the dedication of those withdrawal penalties to protect farmland permanently, or allow for planning at the state and or local level. Lastly, amendments to the agricultural district policies that could increase the score. And North Carolina does have a number of measures that did score well in that, but there are opportunities to improve. So looking at siting requirements for the location of districts, limitations on annexation, and limiting public investment of public facilities in districts. Also requiring a notification, review, and approval by local planning authorities. This could be a challenge where a number of voluntary ag districts already exist in North Carolina. So if we're looking at counties that are adopting an ag district, some of these may be a little bit more feasible. The other challenge would be determining if you could revise the ordinances to include some of these requirements. The state could also offer additional tax incentives to enrolled landowners. Delaware offers property tax exemptions for land enrolled in districts and exempts them enrolled land from transfer taxes. Lastly, I believe North Carolina already offers protection from nuisance suits, but other states also offer protection from unreasonable local regulations. A suggestion that may prove useful in North Carolina would be a streamlined process for permitting ag structures. And having worked with farmers in we just lost it. No, we're back. Having worked with farmers in Mecklenburg, I know that this can be a challenge, is going through that permitting process, just because some of those smaller farms specifically kind of fall into a gray area as far as the permitting agencies are concerned. Aside from that, just convening a group of stakeholders would be helpful in developing a package of additional incentives or benefits that would fit well for North Carolina.
So Leslie, I think you said that some states condition some of their tax advantages to farmers to actually being in some sort of a farmland preservation program or an ag district or a purchase of conservation easement program.
So some of these are overlap a little bit. So there was the tax exemption for those who are enrolled in some sort of a voluntary ag district or their state's version of that. But there are some other mentions in the tax relief for, I have to go back to my notes to see what I had said, but I believe that there's a lot of overlap. So you could look creatively at some of these things for North Carolina to see what makes the most sense.
Evan, I know we have voluntary ag districts in 90 counties now, is that correct? What is your opinion about conditioning any of our tax incentives on people actually having their land in voluntary ag districts or in some sort of preservation program?
Yeah, and that's something that's been explored. Again, present use value is so important, and we know how vulnerable it can be, especially with other pressures. So I don't know if taxation is the best route. Again, I would reframe that as a direct financial incentive for enrollment in voluntary ag districts or enhanced voluntary ag districts. I think we have the vehicle in place right now with the Enhanced Voluntary Ag Districts program to have a funded conservation agreement. Some of you may be familiar with the Market-Based Conservation Initiative. We can have some type of funding, whether it's a standardized structure or individual counties, whether that's based on the reverse bidding process or a percentage of land rental rates or property taxes. There's different formulas that we could use because there's going to be different land use pressures across the state that it might fit better in some places than others. So I don't know if taxation's the right way to go about it. I think the direct financial incentive is something that is something that we can get on the ground much more quickly.
Thank you. The next question is for you, Evan. Leslie was talking about PACE programs. That stands for Purchase of Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, and that's what the next question is about. Evan, what advice would you give to a landowner who is considering putting land in a conservation easement? Who would you recommend as the landowner's first point of contact, and what would be the most important legwork or paperwork that the farmer could complete before even beginning the process to make sure that the process runs smoothly?
This is a great question, and it can be an all-day workshop, but I'll try to summarize it the best I can. So the most important thing for landowners is to understand the deed of conservation easement. This is the legal document that details the restrictions on the property, the allowable uses, and the rights retained. So we have our easement templates available for download, and you can read the exact language of these conservation easements. You need to read through it, and if it's something that you don't agree with or can't do, then it might not be the right program. But there's a lot of flexibilities in these easements because we want to ensure that ag operations stay viable in the future. So on the spectrum of conservation easements, our agricultural conservation easements tend to be the most flexible. We want to ensure the long-term viability of ag operations. So understanding the easement document is the first step. The next part is to understand that these are perpetual. So this is a very heavy decision. It's forever. So that will go into some of the thought process on how you structure your easement. The easements through our program, we can customize the boundaries, so to speak. So you don't have to encumber your entire property. You can customize the boundaries. So that can have an impact on what areas may be reserved for family members or other types of business operations that might not be compatible with the conservation easement. The third thing would be to understand how much the easement is worth. And so just quickly on how that is done, we would take the fair market value of the property, and then we would take the value of the property with the easement on it. The difference between those two is the easement purchase value. And so there's a combination of cash considerations and tax incentives that build that easement purchase value. So if that number works for you, after talking with your accountant and tax advisors, if that number works for you, you take all of those things you just learned about and take it to your family. Is this something that works for your family's vision and the vision of the ag operation into the future? So if all that works, then you can contact our office. You can contact your local soil and water conservation district or your local land trust. We would play matchmaker with some of the entities on the ground. We provide grants to counties and land trusts, not to individuals, so you have to work with one of those local partners. But once you have that relationship with the local entity, then you kind of go into the preliminary application phase. And there's really three things that I encourage landowners to look at before going down the path of an application. One would be to speak with your lender. These easements would require a payoff agreement or a subordination agreement. So if your lender is not willing to accept a subordination agreement, which would ensure that the easement survives any type of adverse action, you really have a non-starter. So speak with your lender first. The next two items will be title and environmental. Do you have clear title? Just a quick example, we cannot accept a quitclaim deed. Are there any title defects? Are there liens or judgments? Some things can be fixed, some might not be able to for this process. So understanding your title, and then with environmental concerns. This is really going to be a sliding scale, and I'll give you just two on almost both ends. One would be abandoned equipment and vehicles. We'll get those cleaned up before, and you won't have a problem. Some things like petroleum or pesticides that have penetrated the groundwater. That might be a bigger issue. It might disqualify the project, or we might have to make major adjustments to the boundaries. So if we take care of those things that are what we call showstoppers, that can kill a project, the lender, title, and environmental, if we clear those hurdles, we can get to the finish line with a conservation easement.
Evan, have you had situations where maybe the landowner should have discussed it with their tenant, if they had a tenant farmer on the land, that might have been a good idea to let them know what the easement said?
So again, going back to the whole purpose of these easements, a typical lease will be allowed in these types of easements. Now, it's important to know that if there's a written lease that does not have an end date, that would have to be taken care of before we go through this process. So there could be things as a part of that lease that might be incompatible with the terms of the conservation easement. So I know Andrew Brandon has some great resources on how to structure these leases. We recommend that all leases are written and for a certain time period, which is short, because long-term leases or indefinite leases can be an issue with these conservation easements. But in a typical scenario, they're not going to be a problem because, again, going back to the purpose of these easements, keep the ag operations viable.
Thank you. Stephen, has your group studied any farmland or open space preservation concepts that we haven't discussed today? Do you have any opinion on transfer of development rights programs and whether they could be successfully implemented in North Carolina?
A few things to add here. One of the things I would say we've studied is our definition of farming. As much as it was referenced bona fide farms in North Carolina and related statutes, we actually have a definition of farming that we've seen provide some value and utility to proprietors within the unincorporated areas of the county. Specifically, our definition of farming in our zoning ordinance does not necessarily involve the present use value program. Specifically, there's properties that are less than 10 acres. Could be 1 acre, could be 3 acres. We interact with people that have an interest in agriculture, be it selling agricultural products, not on a commercial scale, but just growing flowers, growing crops, raising animals, whatever it may be. So we've been able to change the definition of farming and work with property owners to do farming-related activities, albeit maybe not on the scale of a commercial property or a family operation, but we're finding success there. And what I have learned from the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, it's as simple as a $15 registration fee that I think is required annually. It might be $30, but people can get a license and come into our office and do farming activities or raise animals and horticulture, et cetera, that's not on 10 acres, and they can get some production there, and the state tracks it accordingly. That's why they do that small license. One of the things that I do want to touch base on as far as things we've studied, we've adjusted our land use plan. We really encourage and promote and push development away from the rural and suburban areas towards the 12 existing municipalities in Wake County. Specifically, if they're within 2,500 feet of utilities, we're expecting them to connect on to the local municipal utilities. In terms of whether or not the town or city may want that, that's not always the case, but we encourage growth and push it towards the municipalities to try to preserve areas in the county that we consider in our development framework to be rural or community-based. You had asked about transfer of development rights. That's something that we have not studied, but looking at some of the pre-work, I would offer a couple comments to that end. I don't think North Carolina necessarily has a user-friendly framework for transfers of development rights. I was talking to Mike earlier. I used to live in Texas, and one of the tools I worked with in Texas, albeit at the city of Houston at the time, was tax increment financing districts, which we'd never used before, which has led to a 32% vacancy rate inside Beltline 610 to one of the most prosperous downtowns. So it started with a risk and an innovation, and it's been doing quite well. That involves 3 stadiums that I think about when I see them on television. In terms of why did I mention that, there's other states that are, I think, more user-friendly. I'm going to give you some outdated examples of under the Glendening administration in Maryland 10, 15 years ago, they had transfer development right programs that interacted, how counties interacted with each other in the towns. In Florida, you had what was known, I believe it was under the Martinez administration, similarly some 15 years ago, concurrency, where you had to keep pace with the infrastructure as development was taking place and pay for the infrastructure that was going along. I've not really had many discussions nor been entertained in my role within the county. I've been there 18 years with transfer of development rights. What I would say to people, and when I've had the conversation or tried to initiate it myself, I would encourage transfers of development rights be pushed towards existing infrastructures, and in North Carolina, what we have extraterritorial jurisdictions. Extraterritorial jurisdictions, ETJs, depending on the municipal size, can go 1 to 3 miles out and extend some of their authorities with their infrastructure to improve their roads and different types of service like sanitation and fire and police. But that's something that I want to make sure I'm very transparent with all of you today. I'm not an authority on, but I think that it's a good time to have this type of conversation. And in the event that people would start having this conversation, my personal thinking as a professional, we won't say how long I've been doing this, would be encouraging it towards existing infrastructure, tying it into municipal systems, and working within the extraterritorial jurisdictions. In theory, and this is theory, that would slow down the pace of land conversion and loss of land accordingly.
In the interest of time, we're going to cut off the questions. I'm just going to go through the panelists and see if you have any final thoughts to wrap it up, any causes for concern or causes for hope that we have here in North Carolina on loss of farmland.
I think the good news for North Carolina, and I'm fairly new to North Carolina. I'm one of those migrants who moved here from Texas 7 years ago, from Houston, in fact. But one of the benefits of North Carolina, we have the second largest rural population in the country, and I think even those who live in major urban centers have a connection to rural areas and agriculture, and you see that in policy. The challenge is we're becoming more urbanized. There's a chance of disconnecting from that connection between urban and rural. What happens in those 551 municipalities, not just the largest cities, have impacts to the rural areas, unincorporated, the farming areas as well. So I think that's going to be the challenge going forward. As I also mentioned, the aging of the population is just going to be a different mindset as we get used to the challenges with an aging population and how we handle that in the future.
Leslie?
I will second what Dr. Klein mentioned about the aging population. That is one of the biggest drivers of farmland loss, is the aging population of farmers. There is a mismatch and a disconnect between the young farmers versus senior farmers, and per what I read in the Vermont study, over 45 is a senior farmer and under 45 is a young farmer. So there are some mismatches based on even the commodity types that each age group is growing, or the financial aspects. And most of those farmers don't have succession or transfer plans for their properties. So those are some really important things to keep in mind. And the other thing I would mention is there's been a lot of discussion about zoning and the lot size, and our studies have found that the low-density residential development is actually the bigger threat to farmland loss than high-density urban development. So planning is really crucial. There was mention of, I think in an earlier conversation that our panel had about water quality rules and critical watersheds, where having low-density development is super important. So it just really emphasizes the need to be creative and look at your planning so that you can, balance your compact development, balance out the areas where you need to protect a different resource. So, that's what I've got.
Evan, any final thoughts from you?
In many respects, federal and state policy is the toolbox, and local government is really the implementators on the ground. And to me, it's been so important to emphasize the involvement of local planning and zoning processes. And one of the most encouraging things that we've seen in the past couple years are the explicit inclusion of agriculture in land use plans. Previously, it was lumped in as open space or green space. Having that distinction for agricultural land is very important for local land use plans. And then, of course, the emergence of local farmland preservation programs that provide matching funding to state and federal programs. We have to be competitive in the financial packages we offer to landowners. We cannot compete with developers. So as I say, all the landowners have to have a little bit here for this process. But the more we can add to that, it makes everything much more competitive. And we are so appreciative of the General Assembly reenacting the conservation tax credit. That's just going to be another great financial incentive for landowners that want to participate in this program. And another encouraging, there's encouraging and not so encouraging in this one. The last grant application cycle, we received more applications and more grant requests in dollars than in the history of the trust fund. The bad part is there's a big shortfall. So there's an increased demand, and so we need to have more investments through state appropriations for the program so that everybody that wants to participate can.
Thank you. Stephen, do you have any final thoughts for us?
I do. I'll just try to bulletize here. There's three things I'd like to suggest that people in the audience take into account as a takeaway here. We've talked about lot size, zoning. To build from what Evan just said, there's three items I'm going to share with you that I think are really critical because they set the stage for zoning. Zoning is the end result. So those three items would be the local land use or comprehensive plan, the local capital improvement program, that's where your streets, roads, bridges, buildings, how they're funded and their sequencing, and getting familiar with what's happening in the municipal extraterritorial jurisdiction. So those three items, the local land use plan, the capital improvement plan, and what's happening within the extraterritorial jurisdiction, those dictate where growth is encouraged and emphasized in terms of local governments. So I would just share that with you because frequently when I intersect with customers, I'm in public hearings, they're like, how did this happen? And so zoning is the end result of the planning tools I just identified for you. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our panel discussion.